So, good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Castendos, for the nice introduction. When I was requested to deliver this lecture, I started to think what could be the most direct way for conveying a few key messages, or at least some aspects that I consider that are particularly important in relation to the issue of ignorance, that is the thematic issue of our lecture series here. And more in general, some concepts that could help us to have a positive approach toward a very complex millenary region, the Middle East. With this purpose in mind, I thought a bit about this lecture, and I constructed this in two parts. The first part, I selected a few images that could convey these aspects, these messages that I thought that were important, so providing a kind of analytical framework for the second part that is more focused on the new book project on which I'm working here at FRIES. So let's start from the first of these 6 images. All of these images and also the second part are all connected in different ways from different angles to the issue of ignorance. This first, in this case a painting, I've chosen this in order to discuss about the issue of the relevance of symbols. So symbols that we very often use in order to approach this region, symbols that are taken sometimes for granted, somehow that are part of the region since time immemorial, and we tend often to ignore much of the background about these symbols. In this case, this painting refers to the Lepanto battle in 1571, one of the major historical battles between the so-called West and the East. If you, in this case, the vessels of the Christian Holy League were facing the fleets of the Ottoman Empire. If you happen to go to visit Rome and you happen to visit the Galleria Colonna, Marcantonio Colonna was the admiral of the fleets of the Holy League. You will notice that there are very big paintings made by mainly European painters, in which the Christians were depicted through these big crossed sails, of course because of the importance of the cross and, from a religious evocative perspective. The other, the enemy, was perceived through this, the crescent moon, so that you can see in these sails that are a little bit smaller in blue. The point, however, is that this other, the enemy, did not recognize, did not portray itself in any way through that symbol. The crescent moon was simply a decorative symbol, nothing more than a decorative symbol used in many, many other contexts beyond the Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, and for many centuries before that time. What happened is that with the passing of time, millions of people started slowly first to accept and then slowly to self-identify through a symbol that was imposed on them from outside in order to better grasp, understand, control, simplify that reality. We can broaden this issue to a number of other topics connected to borders, states, and many, many others. Here I've quoted Benita Parry, that is one of the leading scholars of post-colonial studies. Parry wrote that coercive power has often had a seductive turn. And this is very much the case. Very often a powerful actor entering a certain context, imposed a certain view, and at the end of the day, you see the local population started not only to accept, sometimes to fight, to spread blood in order to appropriate of an idea that was imposed in order to better understand and simplify that reality. And we arrive to the second image, very much connected to the first one, that is connected to the importance of concepts. We have seen the first one connected to symbols. I could have chosen many other symbols, so I thought that that one was a good example. In this case, we arrive to concepts. And once again, how much we ignore about concepts that we take for granted, that we assume that are part of the Middle East, that we continuously read expression about capital, citizenship, private property, and many other concepts like that, without putting them in context. In this case, I've chosen this image because I wanted to convey the idea of richness. through these colors. You can see in this case the dark green, the Shia components, the Sunni with the light green. We know that in the Islamic world, whatever that expression means, about 85% of the Muslims are Sunni, while about 12% are Shia. But this makes sense only if we consider countries that are very far away. For example, Indonesia, the biggest Sunni Islamic country in the world. If you stick just to the Middle East, the balance between Shia and Sunni is much more equal. What is important is that this region should not be perceived in any way just as an Islamic or Arab region. Here I've mentioned just few examples: Druze, Zoroastrians, Mandaeans, Yazidis, Jews, and many, many other groups. And what is relevant, and is the main points that I will admit with the second point of this analytical framework, is that these rich components started to perceive themselves in terms of minorities or majorities just relatively recently, just a little more than 100 years ago. You will never find any single primary source produced by the local population in the region, or for the matter from Western powers, Western observers, referring to the local composition in terms of minorities and majorities 110 years ago. Some of you might be familiar with the concept of Millet system. That was the system through which the Ottoman authorities gave some form of autonomy to different religious groups in the Ottoman Empire. However, this is a very different concept. And first of all, it was not a top-down system, where I was often portrayed, but was mainly a bottom-up practice. And again, it's very problematic to equate the idea of minority with the idea of Millet or the Millet system, are very different concepts. Here I've quoted just two scholars that I thought that could give us just a little hint of what I'm referring. One is Aaron Rodriguez, that wrote, "Nothing in the political system of the Ottoman Empire called for different groups to merge into one. That particular arrangement, therefore, renders invalid all our terms for debate about minority-majority, which are all extraordinarily European-centered." Stephen Longrig, another scholar, 6 decades ago went a step forward in contending that the often drawn picture of Syria as a mosaic of minorities, and this of course has certain relevance also for our days, can be misleading. And this is not only by ignoring the immense preponderance of the Sunni Muslim population, but also by unduly emphasizing the elements which separated this majority from the rest and minimizing the wide common ground which all shared. Again, this minority-majority is a very key issue also in our times, but this can be broadened to a number of other issues. Just let's think about the issue of borders. One day you create a border between present-day Israel and Lebanon, and what was one day a merchant, after a few days could become a smuggler, a good could become a contraband, and all these concepts that could be created in a matter of few months. And this goes beyond this, the concept of capital. The concept of capital that we take for granted today. In Arabic, you say al-asima, the capital. Again, you will not find one single way of expressing this concept in classical Arabic. Of course, there are some ways of expressing the importance, the relevance of a certain city, Damascus, Jerusalem, but in its political and administrative meaning, you will not find a single way of expressing this. Al-Asima, that is the concept that we know today in Arabic, in past times was simply the line that divided the ancient caliphates from the Byzantine Empire, nothing more than this. Did not have any whatsoever connection to the concept of today of present-day capital. And again, we can broaden this to the issue of citizenship, something so important in the West that goes back to the ancient Latin with the concept of cives, or the ancient Romans with the concept of cives, or the ancient Greeks with the concept of polites. Again, today we use the term in Arabic jinsiya. Jinsiya is a term, it's a concept that has been introduced relatively recently, again, in order to convey an idea that was important, that was relevant for the one that were coming, observing a reality from outside, but that for the locals had very little meaning. So I think that we can draw two major lessons from these few points that I was making, from this second point that I was making. The first one is not that two different cultural universes cannot be compared, or that it's impossible to translate different contexts from different geographical areas, cultural contexts and so on, but just that from different cultural premises, human beings tend to draw very, very different cultural conclusions. And the second point is that the introduction of many of these concepts that we continuously read in the journals, often out of context and so on, were very much, of course, part of a process to redefine a local reality in terms that could be more suitable, more useful, more familiar to the eyes, in the eyes of the one that were coming from outside. The third point that I would like to make in this analytical framework connected to the issue of ignorance and more in general and to the way of approaching the region is connected to what I term as the relevance of the point of observation. It's so important, it's very important to... sorry. It's, I think that it's so important to always keep in mind that also how we name a certain reality tells us very much about what we will ignore or on what we decide to pay more attention and so on. I've chosen this image, this map, among many others, could have chosen many others. In this case, there was a map that was produced by Heinrich Buntig, that was a German Protestant geographer, German Protestant pastor, that produced this map. If you see it, you can see in the center, this circle was written Jerusalem. From a perspective, Jerusalem was the center, in a way, center of the world. And you can see these leaves. By the way, this you can find still today in Safra Square in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem City Hall is very much there, very clear. You can find these leaves with Europe, Asia, and Africa. So this Jerusalem is the center of the world. This is the perspective of this Protestant pastor. If we broaden this and we refer to the way in which this region, roughly speaking, we can say Syria, Iraq, Jordan, present-day Palestine, Israel, the way in which this part of the world has been named by different actors tells us very much a lot on how different actors were looking at this reality and what they ignore about this reality. For instance, this part of the world was known among Assyrians and Persians as Ebernari. From their perspective, in this case it means beyond the river, is the Euphrates rivers. From their perspective, this part of the world was beyond the river, and the river was the Euphrates. From the perspective of Muslim believers, still today, Syria and the broader area is known as Bilad Hasham. Why? Because looking toward the sun, you are in Mecca, that is the holiest city in Islam. You have on the right Al-Yemen. Yamina in Semitic languages means right. Al-Yemen is Yemen, the country that today is witnessing an awful war. And you have Bilad Hasham, the land on the left. So this mirrors this a very religious-centered perception of the region. Again, Bilad Hasham, Al-Yemen. From the perspective of the Crusaders, and they used to refer to this to the Outremer, so beyond the sea, in this case the Mediterranean Sea, from their perspective. While, for example, Levant, that is an expression that today is very much used, mirrors the importance of Italy. Italy in the 15th century, in the 16th century, the city-states like Venice, for example, were so dominant in commerce and so on that this expression, Levant, refers to Mediterranean lands east of Italy. And then you have the perception of the Middle East, that of course is the most well-known expression. You will read continuously, everywhere, in any book of the Middle East, or in any case 99% of the book, that Middle East is an expression that was invented by the British 100 years ago. This is not true. It's probably one of the most ancient ways to refer to this part of the world. It was already used by Orosius 1,500 years ago. It was referring to area of present-day Iraq, ancient Babylon. We have plenty of also Islamic sources, and by the way, was used also by Goethe. Middle Orient, it was used by Goethe in the 19th century, due to the importance of Goethe in the European intelligentsia. Of course, this term became also quite popular at the time. But again, what is interesting here is to think about the perspective. Middle East, of course, is a Western-centric perspective. You are in Europe, this is the Middle East, so somehow it's a projection. But we have to be careful also about this, in the sense there are also many ways in which you have an Oriental-centric perspective. When you refer to the concept of Maghreb, from Maghreb, West, it means that you have a Western-centric perspective. You are in Egypt, you are looking, or you are in Israel or Palestine, you are looking toward West, and you have the Maghreb, how we tendentially refers to North Africa. And again, I could refers to many other way of referring to this part, Mashrek, many other ways of referring to this part of the world. What is relevant in our discussion is that to keep in mind the importance of the point of observation when we discuss about what we know, what we are interested to know, and what we ignore willingly or unwillingly. The 4 points that I would like to make in this analytical framework is connected to something that for me has very strong relevance with ignorance, and it's connected to how human beings tend to forget about things. This image, these statues, you can find them in Dublin today, and this refers to the Great Famine in 1845, when about 1 million of Irish people died. Many others were obliged to leave their homes, many went to the US. At the time, the Sultan Abdul Majid offered to Queen Victoria to give to this distressed population 10,000 sterlings. The Queen Victoria refused these 10,000 sterlings because she said she promised them just 2,000 sterlings. So it would be unthinkable that someone could offer more than the Queen. So Abdul Majid accepted this, if you let me pass the term, this diktat, and accepted to send just 1,000 sterlings. However, secretly, he sent also 3 big ships full of food that arrived in the harbor of Drogheda. And Drogheda United is a football team that plays in the 2nd league in the Irish football league. Still today are honoring this, putting in their emblem this crescent moon and with this cross. Of course, I could have chosen many other symbols, but this is a tiny symbol that reminds us how much we tend to forget about humanitarian interactions, about exchanges, how much we tend to forget. And forgetting is a powerful expression also of ignorance. The 5th point, it's another, I guess, another important expression of ignorance is connected to the power of fear. Fear plays a very important role in the issue of ignorance, and particularly in reference to the Middle East, particularly in the frame of this issue of refugees that are coming in Italy, in Germany, and other countries, European countries. By the way, it's a very tiny percentage. The huge majority of the burden of this is taken by neighboring countries, Lebanon, Jordan, and so on. So I quoted 2 great scholars in this respect. Melville wrote that ignorance is the parent of fear, while Emerson pointed out that fear always springs from ignorance. I tried to convey this point through this image. This image refers to Yarmouk. Yarmouk is a Palestinian refugee camp in Syria. By the way, many of these people died in the months that where this picture was shot. And Yarmouk is one of the areas in Syria that has been affected the most by this war. This wave of desperation, I think, that touches the shores of most of the people. Even if you're not interested in the Middle East, this touched something. And I think that perhaps the intellectual that was able to understand the most, to convey this point, was perhaps Zygmunt Bauman, that just a few weeks ago wrote that seeing people who have lost everything reminds us of our own vulnerabilities, how we could so easily lose our homes, our jobs, and our loved ones. I do believe that this is very true. It's somehow also this kind of image speaks also for our own vulnerabilities. And when we discuss this issue about refugees or the problems that are connected to this, there is also this dimension that should be considered. The 6th and final point in this analytical framework is perhaps a provocation. I asked, knowing too much, is knowing too much also an expression of ignorance? I don't consider this a provocation because I do believe that in a certain context, knowing too much is indeed or might result in a process of generating ignorance. In this case, I've chosen this map that was produced by Lord Kitchener, a member of the Palestine Exploration Fund. The Palestine Exploration Fund was a Protestant organization established in the 60s of the 19th century with the aim, quoting one of their documents, to go to the so-called Holy Land, to Palestine, and to provide the most definitive and solid aid obtainable for the elucidation of the most prominent of the material features of the Bible. They didn't have any whatsoever interest in the place connected to the New Testament. They were interested only in the place connected to the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament. This is partially can be explained by the fact that the places connected to the New Testament, known at that time, were already under the direct control of non-Protestant denominations, so under the control of Catholics, under the control of Orthodox and so on. However, this can be explained with something deeper, with the intention to connect in many ways the Anglican Protestantism to the ancient Israelites and then to the concept of chosen people, and so to explain, to show how the ancient chosen people, the Israelites, in many ways were have been succeeded by the new chosen people, the British. Imposing these huge layers, biblical perspective, through this biblical Orientalism, these huge layers of history with a biblical perspective, ignoring millennia of pre-biblical history, also centuries of Islamic domination, somehow was a form of imposing a certain reality, ignoring much of that local reality. And this went hand in hand with an attempt to identify symbols and also to identify well-defined borders. This tendency was made without paying attention to the local populations, mirroring what Beshara Domani, that is an historian from Brown University, defined as the amazing ability to discover a land without discovering the people. If you see this graphic, you can see that these terminologies used for this division, boundaries, and there are plenty of ways of expressing this concept of division. You will never find anything similar in Arabic or in Hebrew. Simply is not the case. It's something, this richness is something very important, and I think that languages really can explain also deeper meaning about a culture, or it's really the expression of something. So this is also something to take into account. So these 6 aspects, messages, the first one, the importance of symbols, so how much we tend to ignore about these symbols that we take for granted and to apply us to a certain reality, the importance of concepts, again, to the importance of putting context to deconstruct this concept and to apply to a certain reality, the importance of taking account the point of observation that is mirrored in the way in which we address, we name a certain reality, how fast we tend to forgetting as an expression of ignorance, and then the power of fear as a direct expression of ignorance, and then knowing too much, applying layers of history. While I was speaking, for example, I was thinking about the Prime Minister, British Prime Minister at the time of the Balfour Declaration, Lloyd George, that said that he learned the name of the rivers and the mountains of the Holy Land for the Bible much before than the one in Wales, where he was born and he grew up. So imposing somehow these layers of history on a certain reality often brings with it a process of ignoring that reality. So these 6 aspects somehow are part of this analytical framework that are the pillars on which I'm building this new book project, on which I refer now briefly in the second part. And this book project is in many ways connected also to the issue of ignorance, of course, and it's focused on regional demographic trends. Just a few hints to understand on what I'm working, and how it's connected also to the 6 points that I made. Today, the war in Syria is pushing hundreds of thousands of Sunnis to leave the areas under the regime of Bashar al-Assad in direction to Lebanon, in direction to Jordan, with the aim of strengthening the local Shia but also Alawite components of the population. Bashar al-Assad, supported by Tehran, by Iran, stripped citizenship to a number of Sunni Syrian citizens not renewing their identity cards or making the use of biometric documents compulsory. Biometric documents in a war zone, of course, are extremely difficult to be obtained. The regime also carried out systematic demolition of Sunni mosques, and also the repression of Palestinian refugee camps, like the one in Yarmouk that we have seen before, and also granted citizenship to a certain number of refugees, Shia refugees coming from Iraq. It's difficult to say exactly how many in a war zone, but a number of Syrian refugees, of Iraqi refugees. As for Lebanon, Lebanon today hosts over 1 million, some say 1.4 million of Sunni refugees. Many of them are not registered. And this poses an existential threat to an already fragile country, and is already diminishing for the first time in the last decade the influence of Hezbollah, the Shia Islamist group. As for Iraq, the Islamic State is forcing hundreds of thousands of, in this case, of non-Sunnis to leave the area under their authority, in this case with the aim of creating a largely Sunni demographic reality, a goal that has been sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly supported also by Saudi Arabia. This and a number of other religious demographic trends are fostering a growing opinion among a wide number of scholars and also observers, and this is mirrored in a number of articles, academic and non-academic articles, about what has been termed as the ethnocentric stabilization of the region. For example, Joshua Landis, that is the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma, pointed out that we are witnessing the rearrangement of populations to better fit the nation state that were established after the First World War. Other scholars went a step forward in contending that, in this case I'm quoting a controversial scholar, Daniel Pipes, in contending that amid tragedy and horrors, as the populations adapt to the brutal imperatives of modern nationalism, countries like Iraq, Syria, Jordan are becoming, or will likely become, a bit more stable. I will not quote now all these scholars, and some of them are very prominent with this suggestion to create a Shiistan, a Sunnistan, all Jews there, all Sunni there, or Shia there, Alawite there, and so on. What is relevant is that these approaches are very much based on ignorance, in ignoring a very complex local reality, and they can provide just a very tiny frame of a much more complex picture. On the one hand, it seems to imply that the wars that are unfolding in the region can be largely related to religious or ethnic differences. On the other, it seems to imply that dividing populations might provide relatively quick solution to long-lasting stabilization of the region. Here it is enough to mention that for centuries, Jews, Christians, Sunni, Shia, and other religious groups or confessions have lived in this region, reaching a level of coexistence higher, in a comparative perspective, higher than that registered in most of the rest of the world, Europe included. The belonging to a certain set has been for centuries just one, often secondary way of expressing one's identity. This does not mean that we don't have any record about past clashes and so on. We know that in the Baghdad we have primary sources explaining that, showing that in the Baghdad of the Middle Age there were clashes. However, their nature and their scope can hardly be compared to what we're witnessing today. So, in this respect, I do believe that it's very important that we keep in mind that all these cleavages and these sectarian strifes that we are seeing in the region cannot be explained so much with these ethnic or religious aspects, and should much more be related to economics, to practical aspects, very much related to historical events, like, for example, the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the invasion of Iraq by the US in 2003, and also to more recent historical events like the Arab Springs, when local communities felt they didn't have anymore the social security in many respects, so they felt increasingly the need to look inward in search for protection. In conclusion, I think that it's very important to keep in mind that reshuffling the people's region into ethnically or religiously defined states or realities cannot and should not be conflated in any way with a process of regional stabilization. In this sense, the ongoing bloody stabilization of the region can be related to what Osama Magdissim, that an historian from Rice University in the US, defined as the medievalization of the Middle East. That is this tendency to juxtapose an allegedly medieval Middle East to an allegedly secular, normative West. Indeed, more than stabilizing itself through this process of ethnocentric drives, this violence connected to it, the local population are experiencing a sort of getting back into history process, a slow getting back into history process in which this population are trying to get back into history, rediscovering their hybrid identities with all their permeabilities as well as their peculiarities that for millennia characterize the daily life in the region. And I do believe that shedding light on these bottom-up efforts is a powerful antidote to ignorance and also to the geopolitical reductionism that has become so popular nowadays. Thank you very much.